Hey, how we doing? So I want to walk you guys through a double shift. So remember, what we our kind of scenario here is you guys are working at Wawa. You got a management job, and your parents are so proud of you, and you're running this Wawa. So you had economics, and the general manager or the CEO says that you know exactly what you're doing. The problem is we just covered a single shift in a demand curve or a single shift in the supply curve. So the question is well, what if two things happen at once? So this is generally fairly challenging for some students, but the demand curve could shift to the right or left. The supply curve could shift to the right or left. And again, these things are happening simultaneously. So remember, we try to cover demand curve shifting right or left in isolation, but these things can be both happening at the same time. So the demand curve or the supply curve could both be shifting. So we can kind of try and solve that for you. So that's what this tries to cover. So let's say you're working at Wawa and paper prices increase. Well, you have your coffee cup that's made out of paper, so you know that that's going to impact your supply curve because that was one thing that shifts the supply curve. The other thing that's happening, let's say wages are going up or income's going up for the economy as a whole. So you know that's going to impact the demand curve because that's a normal good. All right, so those two things are happening at once. So let's go ahead and fill that in. All right, so like I said, paper prices is an input cost. We're looking at Wawa coffee. That's what we're analyzing. All right, so we write input price, which is a supply curve shift, so no change in the demand curve. Supply would shift to the left. All right. Well, at the same time, incomes are going up. We know that if people have more money and it's a normal good, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. All right. So the question is well, what's going to happen to price? What's going to happen to quantity? Professor Coco only taught me if the demand curve shifts or the supply curve shifts. Well, they're both shifting at once. I don't know what to do there. Don't worry. Don't panic. You can call me up if you're at your job and say, Professor Coco, can you help me out? Or hopefully you can go ahead and look at this. So this table right here is actually in our textbook. So you may want to fill it in if two things happen at once. So if there's no change in demand and there's no change in supply, price and quantity obviously wouldn't change because nothing's happening. But if demand increases and supply doesn't change, price goes up, quantity goes up. That's something we already learned. And same thing here, no change in supply, demand decrease, price goes down, quantity goes down. Again, that's something we've already learned. That's a single shift in the demand curve. Same thing over here, an increase in supply, price goes down, quantity goes up, and increase in supply. So this section right here is if there's a double shift, if demand curve shifts and the supply curve shifts, if they both happen at once. So this is the section that we want to think about right here, right? So here we have supply decreasing. So supply decreasing is right here, and demand is increasing, right? So demand's increasing right here, right? So that would be this box right here is what we're analyzing. What should happen is price should go up, but quantity is ambiguous. So these question marks, and the textbook mentions this as ambiguous. So we don't know what's going to happen to quantity. So really what happens is it depends on how much demand shifts and how much supply shifts. So the first thing you should do is, again, label your y-axis, label your x-axis, price and quantity, label your demand curves, downward sloping, D1, S1, label your P1 and your Q1. So there's three possible outcomes here, depending upon how much demand shifts and how much supply shifts. So the first one over here is one possible outcome. So let's say demand curve. Again, demand could shift big to the right. So far we just drew demand curve shifting to the right. But let's say there's a big shift in the demand curve far to the right. That means incomes are going up a lot. People are making a lot more money, and demand is really shifting to the right there. And let's say supply curve just shifts a little bit, okay? So supply curve shifts a little bit. So here's a big shift in demand, all right? And so you just want to draw a big shift on the demand curve, and then draw a small shift in the supply curve. Let's say paper costs are just going up a little bit, all right? So let's go ahead and draw that in. Again, S2, D2. Now you see a bunch of equilibriums. A lot of students get confused with those equilibriums. Your new equilibrium is going to be where the S2 and the D2 intersect. So that point right there, all right? Not this point over here, not this point, that point. So you go up there, price is going up. So we see over here, price is going up and quantity is going up. So that's one possible outcome, that price and quantity, price going up, quantity going up. Well, what if supply shifts dramatically to the left and demand shifts small to the right? So let's go ahead and draw that. That's a big shift in supply to the left, all right? And let's draw a small shift in demand to the right. Okay, perfect. All right, so again, you want to find where D2 and S2 intersect, all right? I just made a mistake there. So that's S1 and D2. That is not correct. You want to find S2 and D2. So that's the equilibrium, all right? Price is going up. Now this time, supply shifted more than demand. So that actually pushes the quantity down because supply has outstripped demand in this case. So in the original one, both cases we have price going up, but this case quantity increased because there's more demand shift than supply. Here, supply shifted bigger than demand. The last one's a little bit tricky. Now, let's say if they both shift the same amount. So you have to kind of eyeball this. This is where you want your equilibrium where quantity doesn't change at all. All right. So I usually draw this about an inch out or so, and so let's say supply shifts about the same amount here. And let's try and draw a demand curve about the same. You want it to match up right there. If you do that well, that is, as you can see, quantity has not changed at all. It's unchanged. All right. And price has gone up. So as we saw here, price goes up for all three. Price goes up here, price goes up here. But in all three different scenarios based on this, if demand shifts more than supply, quantity will increase. If supply shifts more then demand, quantity will go down. And if they both shift equal distance, then you'll have an unchanged quantity. They'll actually cancel each other out. So again, this is actually fairly challenging for some students. Again, this section right here is a bunch of different scenarios I could have on a test. I could have an increase in supply and an increase in demand. Then price would be ambiguous and quantity would go up. If there's an increase in supply and a decrease in demand, price would go down and quantity is ambiguous. So you would have to do the same thing, a big shift in supply, smaller shift in demand. You'd have to draw all three possible outcomes. This again is fairly challenging for most students. I'd say a good portion of my students generally find this a little bit difficult. But again, I try to give you some real world situations. If you're working at a business, again, maybe it's Wawa, maybe it's another company. Let's say again, the economy is doing well, so wages are going up, but then you also have an impact on your supply costs, and you want to figure out how that's going to impact your overall quantity. And this is the way you would solve that problem. Don't forget, I know this can be a little bit boring and monotonous, but we're ultimately learning this for business, and if you're running a business, it's extremely important. I can't stress the importance of learning supply and demand. All right, good work. Thank you very much. Go ahead and complete this. Take a picture or a scan and go ahead and upload it into Canvas.